It's a great day for my channel as we welcome a distinguished European academic to discuss a pressing issue in Bangladesh. Today, we'll explore how to proceed with reconciliation after the revolution, given how the Hasina regime has deeply divided the nation and left millions as victims of brutal fascist rule. Allow me to introduce my teacher and friend, Professor Victor. He is a philosopher and professor of philosophy with a keen interest in ethics, particularly at the intersection of ethics and philosophy of religion. Viktoras has published works on both Kierkegaard and Levinas, and his current research focuses on philosophical problem of forgiveness. Thank you, Victor, for taking the time to join us. For my audience, I want to clarify that while Victor has followed the revolution in Bangladesh through Western media, but I have also shared the history and narratives that we hold on. Without further delay, let's dive into the first question, Victor. The injustices committed under the fascist regime in Bangladesh have severely impacted the social fabric of the country. Victor, the injustices committed under the fascist regime in Bangladesh have severely impacted the social fabric of the country, placing us at a crucial point in history. The society is divided, and there is an immediate urge for revenge from the victims of the regime, for obvious reason. In this context, how do you define reconciliation in a post-fascist Bangladesh? Why it is crucial for the social and political reconstruction of Bangladesh, and what are the dangers of a lack of reconciliation for the stability and future of Bangladesh? Victor, floor is yours.
First of all, Pinaki, thank you so much for giving me this opportunity to share my thoughts. Indeed, as you mentioned, I follow quite closely the situation in Bangladesh, as I believe many here in the West. Not the last reason for that is because I've met you 2 years ago and had a chance to converse with you about the situation. So my thoughts are with you and with your nation. And of course, your question has many aspects, but I think the crucial distinction that we have to make when we start thinking about any way to move forward is to separate revenge and justice. And the thesis that I would like to propose is that these two things are mutually exclusive. That if you will seek revenge, you will never achieve justice, and vice versa. If you want justice, you have to give up on the idea of revenge. So this is, I think, crucial for any way to move forward in situations like that. And of course, before we go further with this, I think it's a legitimate question. It's a legitimate question to ask. But why shouldn't I go for revenge? Because especially in situations like that, where there's a lot of pain, there's a lot of anger, there's a lot of feeling of injustice, and there's also a chance and opportunity to, to claim my stake in the society. So to say, this is my moment. And I think so it's understandable, if you will, humanly, or at least psychologically, to think, okay, so for all those things that have been done to me, to my family, to my community, to people who are dear to me, or even to the ideas that are important to me, that I hold dear, and which were violated or diminished or marginalized. So I think it's understandable humanly, and I think we should not dismiss this idea of revenge out of hand. But I think one crucial problem with revenge is that it does not stop the cycle. So what it really entails is that everyone who is in power is entitled to do whatever they want, and just to take as much as they can to use the
Mhm.
moment, so to speak,
Yeah. Yeah.
which means that the cycle of violence will never end.
Yeah. The cycle of
And
retaliation. Yeah.
absolutely. And
Yeah.
that I think is unsustainable in the long run. So anyone who cares about the future of their own society, of the community in which they find themselves,
Mhm.
they have to find will. And I think it's a question of will and strong discipline to say, okay, that cycle of retribution stops with me.
Mhm.
And I think it's very, very crucial here to, it's very, very important here to realize that that does not mean that I will not demand justice.
Mhm.
That does not mean that I will not demand justice, but I will make sure to distinguish between justice and
Justice
revenge.
and revenge. Okay.
Absolutely. And I think that means that for the most part, I will not be getting what my anger demands. I will
Mhm.
not be listening to my anger. I will
Mhm.
not be listening to the humiliations
Mhm.
I've endured. I will try
Mhm.
to put them to one side, so to speak, when I think about justice. And so
Mhm.
I will be thinking about not about myself, but about the perpetrator. And so
Mhm.
the crimes that he or she or they have done and
Mhm.
what they deserve for those crimes. So in
Mhm.
many ways, I will be trying to be not the victim, but the judge. Not the victim, but the judge.
Okay. Okay.
And, and it's very, very important that there is no tradition, or I think, okay, I'll be on the safe side. Perhaps there is a tradition, but all the traditions known to me, they never allow a victim to be a judge.
Yes.
For
Of
the
course.
one reason, because
Yep.
victim is violated and it
Yeah.
cannot be unbiased, so to speak. Or it's very, very difficult.
Yeah.
And so I think that's the strategy which I would be pursuing, trying to think, how do I become a judge? But that means I cannot
Without
think.
being biased.
Yes, but
Okay.
that being a judge means being unbiased.
Yeah.
Otherwise you cannot judge.
Yeah.
You know,
Yeah.
so, but that means I have to put, and that doesn't mean stop being a victim. I think there is a place for being a victim. So for uh, living through your suffering,
Mhm.
acknowledging the pain that you had,
Mhm.
but realizing that this cannot be my guide in thinking about what shall be done
Mhm.
with the perpetrators of crimes.
Mhm.
It's not the victim's role to decide. Victim will demand, for the most part, revenge, and that's not what we need for
Revenge
the
or justice?
reasons. Yes, for the reasons that we discussed. I think what we should demand is justice rather than
Mhm.
revenge.
Mhm. Mhm. No, so and the way you put forward the idea of becoming a judge rather than being a victim. So don't you think that it's a kind of theoretical proposition which is very difficult to achieve?
Well, of course, it's a theoretical proposition which is very difficult to achieve. But I think, as many things first exist in theory, and then we try to put them in practice because we believe that these theoretical propositions could work rather than the other ones that have not worked in the past. So, of course, it is a theoretical
Mhm.
proposition, but I wouldn't say, and I would agree that it's difficult to achieve, but I would say
Mhm.
that it doesn't mean that it's impossible. I think we have communities
Mhm.
and examples of communities and societies that have gone through certain divisions. There are, histories of civil wars are always examples of divided communities that after that have to go through certain processes of reconciliation. And there is no society which would come to reconciliation through the means of revenge.
Well, that was exactly my next question.
Mhm.
Can you share some examples of other countries and communities and societies who successfully pursued that idea of being the judge without being biased?
Well, the first society that comes to my mind is South Africa after apartheid. Well, of course,
Okay.
we had a long history of racial discrimination, which was
Mhm.
structural and
Mhm.
politically um, legalized and established in
Mhm.
South Africa. And after it was abolished, South African society had to go through the processes of reconciliation, which was extremely difficult because the processes that went on during the apartheid era were so pervasive, and there was no South African who was untouched by those processes, and it lasted for decades.
Yes.
So, of course, there's always a possibility and it would be silly to deny that, you know, it's not everything rosy in South Africa at the moment. There are still racial tensions and whatnot. But I think in general, there is a broad agreement that South Africa has gone through a really powerful transformation in the last 3 decades or so, by trying to deal with its past and with the division of the society that was going on, and which that was rather violent and aggressive during the period of apartheid. And there are many studies done about the processes that took place and about the dynamics that occurred in South Africa. But so we can't really, you know, disclose it in full. But at least to my mind, what seems was crucial in South Africa, it was that to achieve reconciliation, was that first and foremost in South Africa there was a demand to tell the full story. And so the committee in South Africa was called for the Committee for Truth and Reconciliation. And truth was a non-negotiable condition to for the society to move forward. And there were lots and lots of practices how in local communities people would get together, both black and white, and would just tell their stories. And it is.
Is it something? Sorry to interrupt. Is it something that you told us transitional justice?
Well, I wouldn't call it a transitional justice in.
Okay, then we'll go back. We'll come back to this point after.
Yeah, maybe we can come back to this. But I think here it's perhaps you could interpret it as a way towards justice, as a necessary condition. But I think even without giving it this terminological bent, I think it's pretty clear what was taking place, in the sense that first and foremost, what the victims want is the acknowledgement that some harm has been done to them, some acknowledgement from their own society and or community on a smaller scale. And so it is extremely important for the victims to give them voice, so that they're allowed to share what really happened to them. And also, I think on the other side, it is extremely important to give voice also, or to the possibility to the perpetrators, if they are willing to acknowledge what they have done wrong, that this space is created where all these stories can be shared. Because I think it's extremely important for, in order to move forward, for those who committed some crimes, who violated some laws or some communal principles, that they can be allowed to, that they are allowed to acknowledge to their own community in order to move forward.
Okay, so sorry to interrupt. So if I understand you well, so you are proposing that the first, we need to give voice to the victims. Number one, they have to tell their full story, what did happen to them, and if possible, we need to engage also the perpetrators into this process to acknowledge the fact and to say they are part of the story. So that means it becomes creating a space for telling the story from both parties, for all the stakeholders, be it victim, be it perpetrator, in presence of the civil society. Am I right?
Absolutely. And
Okay.
especially it's important in small local communities where very often everyone knows what has been done.
Mhm.
Everyone knows the crimes that have been committed, and everyone knows by whom they were committed. But
Okay.
because of the regime of oppression that was in place
Mhm.
uh, before the change, that was never articulated in the communal space.
Mhm.
So it remains private knowledge. And I think it's extremely important that is being articulated in the community, in the town hall, or in the town square, or in the just a gathering of community leaders, where
Okay.
people get to one truth, so it's not left unspoken. It's extremely important for the victims, and it's been shown by a raft of research, just to be able to share the pain that they had
Okay.
with their community, and but also for the perpetrators who have who are ready to acknowledge that they committed crimes, or that they have done something wrong. Perhaps it's not a legal crime, but something that they think their community would not approve of, so that they can share that too, and they can say sorry, or they can just acknowledge their guilt. So that space, I think, is extremely important, and that creates a space of conversation, which would create this connective tissue within the community and would start the healing. This would start creating the ties between these normally two groups that are divided, but sometimes there's more groups than two.
Mhm.
And we had countries where there were multi-ethnic conflicts, like in the Balkans, let's say. So that possibility of just sharing
Mhm.
loud in a if you will, in a safe space, in the space
Yeah.
where
In a
you're
communal space.
in the communal space.
Yeah.
Absolutely, I think it's
Yeah.
extremely important. It's a condition, and that I think is fundamental. And it's important to say, so far when we speak about the truth, about just articulating, we
Mhm.
haven't said anything about what should be done to the perpetrators. Should it be justice, a court, revenge? What should?
Mhm.
Nothing about that. And it
Mhm.
doesn't mean that that question should not arise. But I think when we talk about what is a must, I think the space where people can articulate what really happened to them in
Okay.
their own subjective way, I think is crucial.
I have a small question. So that's the best possible scenario that the victims are telling their story and the perpetrators are acknowledging that fact that yes, they did wrong, but in if the perpetrators they don't agree to disclose their part or they don't agree to acknowledge their part, so this is the another scenario. So how should we proceed in this scenario?
Well, I think, of course, this is an ideal scenario in the sense that both sides come together
Yeah.
and talk, but and of course, it's not that easy. So we're
Yeah.
discussing what could be ideal, but I think in even if the perpetrators or all perpetrators, and they all of them will never be ready to
Mm,
acknowledge. So some
mhm,
will always deny the
mm.
guilt, or some of
Yeah.
them will
Yeah.
say, "I've never done anything wrong. What's
Yeah.
wrong?
Yeah.
Actually, what's taking place now is
Mm,
wrong."
mm,
So
mm.
that, of course, is that will happen. But I think even if we do not get all the perpetrators to come and share, I think we still will do a lot of good work when we will allow the victims to share what really happened. It's therapeutic to begin with for the victims, just to be able to to articulate what really happened, and to know that they're not alone in
Mhm.
their pain, in their grief, that their community, their society acknowledges that
Okay.
what happened to them was not right, was wrong. I
Okay.
think even without the perpetrators, and as it happened, and as it continues to happen very often, when victims start speaking, very often the perpetrators only then start to realize the real severity of their actions
Of
and
the
the real
reaction.
harm that has been done. And so it triggers also something in them.
Yeah. 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 So I can recall one very iconic photograph that The Americans are showing the photographs and the movies in front of their captured German soldiers, Nazi soldiers, after Second World War. And most of them I have seen, and the faces of the Nazi soldiers, they are hiding their faces, when they see what they have done, they are hiding their faces. So yeah, that can be one option. Well, opening up the space and telling the story and acknowledgement of the story is first part, first stage. Then what next? What about the justice?
I think it's who could be helpful to us in this scenario. And you already mentioned the Nazi soldiers. It's the experience of the post-war Germany, and I highly recommend the German philosopher Karl Jaspers, who wrote a book immediately after the war on German guilt, trying to realize really what is the extent of guilt and what kind of guilt should Germans feel. So he distinguished, or he proposed, that there are 4 types of guilt. And those which are important to us in this case are 2 which he thinks come to us from outside, because he thinks the other 2 are the feelings of inner guilt, and they do not really concern the outside world, including the community. So those 2 types of guilt that come from the outside, that is imposed upon us, he thinks, he calls them, one is criminal guilt and the other is political guilt. And criminal guilt is very straightforward, is the guilt that you get for violating the laws that are in your country, or in the legal system in which you find yourself. And so it seems obvious to me, although I'm really outside observer, that some of the actions that were committed by police force and intelligence services and other institutions in Bangladesh, they were violating the laws that were at the time in place in Bangladesh.
Of course.
And that means that if we talk about justice, that they should be punished according to the laws of the country. And it should, I think it's the demand of justice that those people who committed crimes have to get the punishment according to those crimes.
Yeah, and actually, who are engaged in enforced disappearance and extrajudicial killing and
absolutely,
of course,
secret prisons and things like that. And it's even to the extent of intimidation and etc. So illegal detention, things like that. And I think it is in the interest of the whole Bangladesh society that crimes like that are punished. But I mean punished in a legal way, not in a personal way, not in the sense of revenge. I don't like you. If I were a citizen of Bangladesh, I would like to think that I would be demanding that it is strictly legal procedure, that those who committed crimes are punished for those crimes, because that promises to us a society in which everyone is held accountable in front of the law. And that means also in front of the whole society. So I think it does what we spoke about, telling the truth and being able to acknowledge your crimes and in front of your community. I don't think that this is this absolves you from legal repercussions. I think it's the opposite. One thing is to try and reconcile with your own community and to acknowledge in front of them as members of your own community the things that you've done. But also the other aspect of it is that you committed actual crimes, and these crimes have legal repercussions. And I think Bangladeshi legal system should pursue that, because that will give a feeling to Bangladeshi society and a promise to Bangladeshi society that justice works, that justice is in place in Bangladesh, but precisely justice, not revenge. And the other type of guilt that Karl Jaspers proposed. that Karl Jaspers proposes is political guilt. And this type of guilt, he says, is the guilt that everyone who is a member of certain political community
had committed.
that member of that political community has, because something that has been done in the name of that political community. So let's say in Karl Jaspers's view, every German has some political guilt for the Nazi crimes, because the Nazi regime was doing that in the name of German political body, of German political community. In the same sense, you could say now in Russia, what is Russia doing in Ukraine, waging an aggressive and unprovoked war against Ukraine, that every Russian citizen has a portion of political guilt for that, because it's being done in the name of Russian political community or in the name of Russian state.
Okay, understood. But how to deal with this political guilt?
Well, I think political guilt, the importance here, and of course, a lot of people criticize the Jaspers for that, is that, you know, perhaps we should use a less charged term in this context, not guilt, but responsibility. But in this case, Jaspers says that every member of political community is responsible for what is happening. And so he would say that, you know, for the situation that is now in Bangladesh, politically are responsible all members of political community of Bangladesh.
Hasina's party, Army League and Hasina's party.
Yes, and I think what he would say is, of course, that it doesn't mean that everyone is responsible or guilty equally, because it also depends on the political power you have within your political community. But in a way, you know, what happened in the last month or so in Bangladesh, it is precisely that. It is Bangladeshi citizens taking responsibility for their own political community and saying, you know, we need change, because this is what is taking place is not okay. So perhaps responsibility here is a better term than guilt, because guilt implies doing something wrong. But Jaspers was thinking, just to remind you, after World War II. So for him, of course, the prevalent example was the German society of the Nazi regime. And so in that sense, he held every German, at least, of course, partially, but guilty for the Nazi crimes. So you have to, you have to carry the burden for the things that have been done. And in that sense, I think what he would imply is that, of course, the usual argument is that a lot of people couldn't do nothing, because, of course, the police power or the SS in the Nazi Germany case or other state apparatus would prohibit you. But Jasper says, but yes, that's true. But at the same time, a lot of Germans knew what's taking place, but they didn't do anything. They gave up, so to speak, in advance. They turned away. And I think we can all recognize that. You know, I was born in Lithuania when it was still occupied by Soviet Union. And early 80s, Lithuanian society was very peaceful. Not really, there were no really protests against Soviet occupation, although you wouldn't find a lot of people who would have liked it. And so in a way, of course, we were all responsible for that regime going on, because we didn't do enough as a collective body. So I think that's what Jaspers means by political guilt. And you get that guilt in the sense just because you are a member of certain political community. And so in that sense, every Bangladeshi citizen is responsible for the situation in which Bangladesh finds itself. And I think it shouldn't be read as something accusatory, although it could be, but I think it's also an invitation to feel responsible for your own community, and also for the future towards which your community will go.
So you said 4 crimes. So number 1 is criminal obligation, political obligation or political guilt. And what are the other 2?
The other 2 are forms of guilt. So one is the guilt of conscience, and the guilt of conscience, which means that I just feel guilty for something that I have done, and I just have this, inner feeling or inner voice. Very often, it can be something that others don't think that you should feel guilty about, but for some reason you feel guilty. You think I shouldn't have done this. That's not right, and it's just kind of inner dialogue that you have. So that's something that no one can put on you from outside, but it's just your inner moral compass, sometimes we say. So that's the third type. And the fourth type is what Karl Jaspers calls a metaphysical guilt. A metaphysical guilt for him is just the guilt of being a human being, in the sense that you are aware of your own limitations, and that you never do enough. You always can do what you don't. And so it's kind of this guilt of being a human being, and knowing that there's so much in the world that could be fixed, and of course you could be doing more, but you are not. And in Jaspers's view, that's just a universal human condition. So that's the in very, very broad terms what's metaphysical guilt.
Or something like Israel is bombing Gaza, and I'm looking at this bombing and doing nothing. Something like this.
Something like that. So yes, you could say so. In Lithuania, maybe this example is not that prevalent. But I when I was talking about this with some friends a few days ago, the example I used was South Sudan. So South Sudan in Lithuania is, I believe, a lot of people wouldn't be able to point where it is, and so we kind of know that something bad is taking place there, and we just don't think about it. And the moment we start thinking about it, we feel guilty, because of course we should be, because it's people, innocent people are dying or suffering, and as humans we feel solidarity with them. But there's also another thing to be said. As humans, we are limited. We cannot carry all the suffering in the world on our individual shoulders, so we also protect ourselves, but that does not absolve us from this metaphysical guilt. I think that's what roughly Jaspers has in mind when he says that. So
let us put this in Bangladesh perspective, because the Hasina regime has been in power for last 15 years, and there has been atrocities and crimes against humanity, and there are people who said that it's not my problem. They had their good life, and they said that it's not my problem. They never raised their voice. So can you say that this is a metaphysical guilt?
I wouldn't say so, because I think for Jaspers, this metaphysical guilt is something that the person feels only within themselves. So it's an inner feeling of guilt. So sometimes I can assume that some people don't have that feeling. So there's I would say there's some disorder with them. They lack empathy, let's say, or they lack interest in anything outside of their own individual existence. And I don't think it's a normal approach to your own existence. So, but I can presume that there are people who do not feel that guilt, but metaphysical guilt is not imposed from the outside.
Okay, that should come from within. That should come from within. Okay.
Yes.
Okay.
Yes. At least in Jasper's view, and
okay. Okay. So, and what is the fourth guilt?
So fourth is the metaphysical. The third was the guilt of conscience. The guilt of conscience. Okay. Yeah. So it's a moral guilt. What we typically call moral guilt, when you feel guilty for having done something wrong, and it's also inner feeling. So sometimes you do something and you feel, I shouldn't have done this. And sometimes you talk to people, your friends, and say, I did that. And friends say, don't worry about it. It's okay. But you still have this feeling that I messed it up. Yeah. And I think it's very typical. It's very recognizable. We have that. But it's also inner feeling. So moral guilt and also metaphysical guilt.
Okay. Now very crucial question. Why should I go for reconciliation? How should it the process of reconciliation helps a country to progress, helps a country's economy, helps a country's community. Why should we go for it?
Well, I think it's a question of survival. You have to ask yourself the question: do you want Bangladesh to exist as a
Yeah.
community, as an entity? And if you want Bangladesh to exist as a community, you have to find some sort of peace, some sort of peaceful coexistence.
Mm-hmm.
And otherwise, you'll be always at war with each other. And at some point, everything will collapse. So it will be, if we talk about politics, it will be eaten by neighboring countries, divided and occupied, annexed. And we've seen in history many examples of that. When a country, a conflict with itself, in a conflict, is being taken apart by outside forces too. So I think it's a question of survival. If Bangladeshi political community wants to exist as a community, it has to find a way of how to live together, which is not a constant division and constant conflict in the sense of winner takes all. There is this concept of that when we have a conflict, so we'll find out who is the winner, and then the winner takes everything and the loser gets nothing. And that's a very unproductive way of resolving conflicts, because that loser is always unhappy. So he's always, or them, they're always waiting for their chance for revenge. And when they win, then they try to take everything. And so I think it's a much more sustainable way of resolving a conflict is trying to find a compromise where, we acknowledge each other's differences. We acknowledge that we are not all the same. We have different values. We have different fears. We have different traumas. We have different plans. So I think if you want Bangladesh to exist and to have and also to have prosperous future, it is a question of how to find peace within the community, and that peace shouldn't be a peace of where a winner oppresses the loser, because that tension will remain, and at some point it will be like a sand clock. It will be reversed, and the loser will become the winner, and it will be an endless cycle of violence.
Exactly. So we are coming to an end. So my last question is, given the fact that you know the history of Bangladesh and the recent history of the revolution and what the past regime, Sheikh Hasina regime, did with its own people. So what is the concrete first step that you recommend to initiate the process of reconciliation?
I think it has what has to happen, I think the trust in political institution has to be brought back. And so normally in cases like that, there's some form of government of national unity is created, where a broad umbrella of different political actors and different political forces agree to work together so that the political community can regain trust in political process, in political institutions, in institutions of justice like courts, in institutions like police that have the power to use force. So it's extremely important, because then you can get citizens on board, and then you can agree on the way forward. So on foundational documents, I'm not sure. I don't know enough about Bangladesh to know if a new constitution is needed, or if it was just a complete misapplication of the old one. But this is for political actors to decide in Bangladesh. But I think it's crucial that as many forces are at the table, so no one monopolizes this process. And it's difficult. it is extremely difficult, because precisely it's difficult because very, very different people with very different ideas get to sit at the table. But it's crucial because it will give legitimacy to the whole process, and it will help to regain trust. And at the same time, I think it's extremely important that on the local level, in the local communities, that
Mhm.
people get the chance to speak, get the chance to tell their truth,
Mhm.
that a certain level of trust is recreated on this local level.
Mhm.
And this is perhaps even harder because it's not one process. There are millions of processes like that. Every village should have a certain process like that. But I think it's crucial. And so uh, I would think that perhaps not the government, but perhaps civic society
Mhm.
could introduce infrastructure like that, some citizen assemblies or meeting groups, just to tell their stories so that people can articulate to each other and to themselves what really happened. I think it's crucial also to start rebuilding the connective tissue
Mhm.
in these local communities and rebuilding trust. And it's extremely painful process. It's an extremely painful process, precisely because these people, they know each other on local level for whole of their lives. Their families have known each other. So to tell each other painful things, it's very, very difficult. But it's also therapeutic, and also it rebuilds trust, which is crucial for the community, because then this cycle of violence can finally stop.
My last question. Given the fact of historic conflicts in Bangladesh starting from 1947 and then 71, our citizens, the people of Bangladesh, might think that the process of reconciliation may not work in Bangladesh. What message of hope or advice would you give to those who fear that reconciliation might not work in Bangladesh?
You know, in uh, in Europe, one example I keep coming back to, uh, it makes me very curious, is the example of Northern Ireland. In Northern Ireland, where I don't know, maybe it's not a famous story in Bangladesh, but Northern Ireland is a territory on the island of Ireland, which belongs to United Kingdom, and it had a long history of communal violence, because there was a religious division and ethnic division in the community, and there was a lot of terrorism, and it seemed like an unsolvable situation, because there were so many grievances, and it really looked like an endless cycle of violence, because each community had a lot of stories of pain, and it seemed impossible to overcome that and to forgive. It was in Europe for decades. It was an example of a completely unsolvable conflict. And in the 90s of last century, something happened, and finally they managed to get the leaders of both communities at the table, and to put aside for a moment uh, the grievances, the pain, but and to start thinking about the future. And so I'm not trying to say that they solved all problems. There's a lot of ethnic tension and religious tension in Northern Ireland, but basically terrorism and the violence stopped. For now 3 decades, it's gone. Of course, it can always come back, and people who follow that will tell me lots of examples of on an everyday level that it's not all rosy. But the terrorism, the terrorist attacks, they have stopped, and it's somehow that gives me a lot of hope, because at the time I remember when I was growing up, it was an example of an unsolvable problem, It looked like it can't be solved. And we certainly are at a better moment now than we were 3 decades ago. So that gives me hope. I think everything is possible. But of course, what it would be really silly of me is to say that it's easy, because it's not. It's very,
Mhm.
very hard. And so I think what my advice would be, to, if I could give any advice, because who am I? But if I could give an advice, my advice would be just prepare that it's gonna be really, really painful. But that's the price you have to pay if you want to be the generation that stops the violence.
Mhm.
Those who will stop the violence, they will have to pay the highest price in a way, because they will have to stop seeking revenge, and that they will have to look at their pain, so to speak, from a side. And that's very, very difficult. But I think it's worth it. It's worth it if you think about the future of your own country, if you think about the future of the next generations, if you think about the future of your children and grandchildren. What kind of country, what kind of community do you want to leave them?
Mhm.
Do you want to leave the country that you inherited from your grandparents, or maybe you want to leave a country which doesn't have that that level of violence and that level of mistrust? And so it is hard, but I think it's worth the price.
Thank you, Victor, for your time and presence. And possibly this is for the first time in Bangladesh. We have been discussing about the process of reconciliation, its challenges, and how it can impact the future generation. Thanks, Victor, for your advice, time, and insight.
Thank you. It was a pleasure.
Bye bye.